If you flew over the Detroit River this morning, you wouldn't see the quiet hum of cross-border commerce. You wouldn't see bustling ports, stacked with containers or trucks inching toward customs checkpoints. Instead, you'd see a war zone in miniature. Shipping containers lie abandoned like fallen soldiers. The once orderly lines of semis are snarled engine hoods open, drivers waving papers with nowhere to go. And on the skyline, cranes idle silent and mocking, shadows of industrial ambition frozen mid-motion. This is what happens when political hubris meets economic reality. At exactly 6 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, lumber, and even maple syrup, a symbolic and symbolic-only gesture that was supposed to demonstrate American resolve. Trade Secretary Linda Harrison announced it with a flourish, calling it a decisive step to put America first. The press release was dramatic, almost cinematic. Bold language, bold promises, a trade victory that would echo through boardrooms and dining rooms across the nation. But by 9:00 a.m., markets were reacting differently. Stock tickers flashed red across financial terminals. Auto manufacturers announced immediate halts on Canadian supply lines. Midwest steel plants, supposedly the beneficiaries of these tariffs, reported delays because the raw materials they relied on couldn't get past the border. "It's a nightmare," one auto executive muttered, speaking off the record. "We've got steel piling up in Ohio, but we can't touch it. It's like being locked out of your own warehouse." On the Canadian side, ports didn't collapse, they adapted. Railroads rerouted, suppliers diversified. Canadian negotiators smiled politely, but inside the conference rooms in Ottawa, there was quiet fury and a meticulous plan taking shape by noon. Canada had retaliated with targeted tariffs on U.S. soy, bourbon and microchips industries, where American lobbyists had been crowing about their leverage. The tariffs hit faster than anyone expected, and the economic pundits began using language usually reserved for natural disasters. Catastrophe, shockwave, cascade. And then there was the public spectacle grocery store. Shelves in Michigan and Vermont began to show shortages of Canadian. Staples maple syrup disappeared. Lumber prices spiked, sending DIY enthusiasts and contractors scrambling. Meanwhile, social media erupted with memes of American trucks, stranded in mud, Canadian moose peering smugly over fences. The optics were brutal. A nation that declared we don't need Canada was suddenly caught on camera begging for Canadian goods, wondering how a country of 38 million people had managed to expose the fragility of America's overconfidence. In today's Deep Dive special report, we will walk you through the tariffs that weren't thought through. We will show you how a trade war designed to demonstrate strength instead revealed weakness. We will dissect the supply chain dominoes falling, the corporate panic behind closed doors, and the political theater on Capitol Hill. As lawmakers scrambled to explain the self-inflicted chaos, the United States wanted a victory instead. It woke up to the cold reality that trade isn't about gestures. It's about dependencies, leverage, and the humility to understand them. A nation that claimed independence found itself shackled. A political gamble meant to project dominance turned into a crater of unintended consequences. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the lesson is as old as commerce itself. Pride comes before a fall, and tariffs are heavy when you haven't done your homework. By midday, Washington was in chaos. Trade advisors, once confident, were now running between offices, phones glued to ears, faces pale. The White House press briefing room, usually a stage for polished messaging, looked like a war room. Spokespeople shuffled talking points, lawyers whispered in corners, and reporters sensed the panic radiating through the walls. The trigger, Canada's response, measured yet merciless. Within hours of the U.S. tariff announcement, Ottawa unveiled countermeasures targeting U.S. exports, totaling nearly $12 billion annually. Canadian steel buyers pivoted to European suppliers. Lumber shipments to American construction companies were halted. Dairy producers diverted supply chains to Asia, and maple syrup, symbolic but iconic, was suddenly off limits to American distributors. The optics were devastating. Midwest factories, anticipating a surge from tariffs on Canadian steel, instead faced a bottleneck. "We literally can't build cars," said a Detroit plant manager on Background. "We've got chassis ready, engines ready, but no sheets of steel. We're sitting on millions in potential revenue, and it's just stuck." The financial news channels were relentless with headlines like, "America's trade war backfires," and "Tariffs turn U.S. factories into parking lots." Even Congress couldn't contain the fallout. Republicans, who had cheered the tariffs, now whispered in hallways about miscalculation. Democrats seized the moment, lambasting the administration for reckless economic posturing. Senator Claire Ramirez, a moderate from Wisconsin, went on record. "We said from the start, you can't start a trade war with your neighbors without a plan. Now jobs are at risk, prices are rising, and supply chains are collapsing." Corporate America responded with unprecedented speed. Major automakers announced delays in production schedules. Lumber distributors raised prices by 25% overnight. Steel tariffs intended to protect domestic manufacturers ironically created shortages, inflating costs for contractors and developers. Meanwhile, grocery stores began rationing certain Canadian imports, leaving shelves looking like a post-apocalyptic version of Thanksgiving. Social media amplified the spectacle. Images of stranded trucks, frustrated drivers, and empty shelves went viral, reinforcing the narrative that the United States had acted impulsively. Internationally, the headlines were merciless. European analysts noted that a country claiming to be self-sufficient had underestimated its dependence on Canada's integrated supply chains. Asian markets watching the U.S.-Canada standoff reacted with volatility. The Dow Jones and Nasdaq both dipped sharply, erasing gains for the day. CNBC anchors, usually measured, described the situation as a textbook case of hubris meeting reality. Within 12 hours, it became clear America's "we don't need Canada" strategy had not just failed, it had boomeranged. What was supposed to be a bold show of independence had become a logistical nightmare, an economic headache, and a PR disaster all at once. In short, the trade war hadn't won any ground. It had exposed vulnerabilities the public didn't even know existed. The U.S. administration had wanted to demonstrate dominance. Instead, it had created headlines of humiliation. And like any unfolding disaster, the first 24 hours were only the beginning. To understand the magnitude of this crisis, we have to rewind to early 2025. The Trump administration, or rather the America First trade team, had been quietly reviewing North American supply chains, looking for leverage points. Publicly, the narrative was patriotic. The United States, a sovereign economic giant, would no longer tolerate trade imbalances, dependency, or what it deemed Canadian overreach. Privately, advisors were calculating political optics. The midterms were looming, and a narrative of toughness on trade could energize a base still smarting from inflation and economic uncertainty. President Trump repeatedly declared that Canada had taken advantage of the U.S. for decades: lumber prices, dairy quotas, auto parts, steel, aluminum. Every statistic was weaponized. "We're being treated like a colony," Trump reportedly told a closed-door meeting in the Situation Room. "We send them steel, we send them maple syrup, we get nothing, we're done being polite." The phrase would become the mantra for the coming trade war. Yet beneath the bravado, the situation was far more complicated. Canada isn't just a neighbor. It's America's largest trading partner in many critical industries: auto manufacturing, steel, aluminum, lumber, dairy, technology. Supply chains cross the border hundreds of times a day in 2024 alone. Nearly $700 billion in goods and services flowed between the two nations. And while political talking points emphasized self-reliance, economists warned that severing these ties abruptly could cripple sectors reliant on precision-timed supply chains. But warnings were brushed aside in favor of narrative, a bold cinematic display of national pride. The administration's plan was ambitious, if naive. Officials promised the public that tariffs on Canadian goods would force negotiations on American terms. They claimed domestic industries would benefit immediately. Jobs would surge and consumer prices would remain stable. "We don't need Canada." Trade Secretary Harrison repeated in multiple interviews, a phrase that became the unofficial tagline of the administration's strategy. The rhetoric was clear: strength, decisiveness, and American superiority. But the reality on the ground was ignored. U.S. manufacturers had integrated Canadian suppliers for decades. Steel for Detroit's auto plants came from Ontario. Aluminum for aerospace and defense contractors came from Quebec. Lumber for residential construction came from British Columbia. Disrupting that flow was